I never thought I'd be the kind of mother who would alter her will to teach her son a lesson. But sometimes life forces your hand in ways you never anticipated. When I lay in that hospital bed for 2 weeks after my heart attack, and my son Jason never once showed up, not even a phone call, I realized I needed to make a change that would either bring him back to our family or reveal his true intentions once and for all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I've always considered myself fortunate. At 63, I had built a good life as a high school English teacher in Burlington, Vermont before retiring 2 years ago. My husband Edward passed away 5 years ago after 38 wonderful years together, leaving me our family home on Maple Street and a lakeside cabin in the Adirondacks that had been in his family for generations. My proudest accomplishments were my 2 children, my daughter Olivia, a dedicated pediatric nurse with a heart of gold who lived just 20 minutes away with her husband Mike and their twins, and my son Jason, who had moved to Boston to pursue a career in finance. Jason had always been the ambitious one, showing remarkable talent with numbers from an early age. Edward and I had supported his dreams wholeheartedly, taking out a second mortgage to help pay for his education at an Ivy League school. Jason married Vanessa, a polished marketing executive who came from old money in Connecticut, and together they lived what appeared to be the perfect life in a luxurious downtown Boston condominium. Designer clothes, exotic vacations, and a gleaming Tesla in their garage. They had all the trappings of success. I'll admit, I was proud of how far my son had come from our modest beginnings, even if visits home had become increasingly rare over the years. "Mom, we're just so busy with work," he'd explain during our brief monthly phone calls. "Maybe you could come visit us sometime. The guest room is always available." But whenever I suggested a date to visit, something would conveniently come up: a business trip, a weekend retreat with Vanessa's family, a networking event that couldn't be missed. I tried not to take it personally. After all, Jason had built his own life now, and I understood the demands of his career were significant. My relationship with Olivia couldn't have been more different. Despite her demanding schedule at the hospital and raising twins, she would bring her family over every Sunday for dinner, help me maintain the garden Edward had loved so much, and call me almost daily just to check in. When the twins had school performances or sports games, I was always invited, sitting proudly in the audience as the doting grandmother. "Mom, you're doing too much," Olivia would often say, watching me prepare Sunday dinner for everyone. "Let me help you." "Nonsense," I'd reply, shooing her away from the cutting board. Cooking for my family keeps me young. And it was true. Those Sunday gatherings were the highlight of my week. It was during one of those Sunday dinners, just as we were finishing the apple pie I'd baked that morning, when I felt the first twinge in my chest. I dismissed it as indigestion, too much garlic in the roast chicken, perhaps. But by the time Olivia and her family had left, the pain had intensified, radiating down my left arm and up into my jaw. I remember reaching for the phone, my vision blurring at the edges, and somehow managing to call Olivia. "I think something's wrong," was all I managed to say before the phone slipped from my fingers. The next thing I knew, I was in an ambulance, oxygen mask over my face, with Olivia holding my hand and looking terrified. "You're having a heart attack, Mom," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But you're going to be okay. I've got you." The doctors at Burlington Medical Center later told me I was fortunate. Olivia's quick response had saved my life. But the damage to my heart was significant. I would need bypass surgery, followed by weeks of recovery in the hospital and months of cardiac rehabilitation. As I lay in the pre-op room, waiting to be wheeled into surgery, Olivia promised to call Jason. "He'll want to be here, Mom. I know he will." I squeezed her hand weakly. "Don't put pressure on him if he's busy. It's a long drive from Boston." "Mom," Olivia said firmly, This isn't about being busy. This is about family. The surgery lasted 6 hours. When I finally regained consciousness in the ICU, Olivia was there, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't left the hospital since I'd arrived. Mike was taking care of the twins, she explained, and had arranged to work from home for the next few weeks so she could be with me as much as possible. "Has Jason called?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed only hours before. Olivia's hesitation told me everything. "He knows, Mom. I spoke to him myself yesterday." "He must be very busy," I said, trying to sound understanding. Despite the sharp ache that had nothing to do with my surgical incision, Olivia's expression hardened. "He said he has an important client meeting this week that he can't reschedule. He promised to come next weekend." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. That's understandable. But the weekend came and went, with no sign of Jason, just a text message on Sunday evening. "Sorry, Mom. Something came up with Vanessa's parents. Hope you're feeling better. Talk soon." Days turned into a week, then 2. Olivia was there every day, sometimes bringing the twins after school to brighten my room with their hand-drawn cards and chatter about their days. My neighbor Ruth brought my mail and fresh flowers from my garden. Even my former colleagues from the high school organized a rotation, bringing homemade meals and books to help pass the time. But no Jason. "It's been 2 weeks, Mom," Olivia said one afternoon, her voice tight with anger. "You had major heart surgery. He hasn't even called to talk to you directly." "He sent flowers," I said weakly, gesturing to the expensive arrangement that had arrived the day before with a generic card signed by both Jason and Vanessa. The flowers were beautiful, professionally arranged orchids and roses that must have cost a fortune, but they felt cold, impersonal. Nothing like the slightly lopsided bouquet of daisies and zinnias that the twins had picked from my own garden. "Flowers aren't the same as showing up," Olivia replied, "and I saw his Instagram yesterday. He and Vanessa were at some charity gala in New York City, all dressed up with champagne glasses, looking like they don't have a care in the world while you're here with tubes coming out of your chest." I didn't respond. What could I say? The truth was too painful to acknowledge. That my son, my firstborn whom I had sacrificed so much for, couldn't be bothered to drive 3 hours to see his mother after a near-fatal heart attack. That evening, after Olivia had gone home and the hospital had quieted for the night, I found myself unable to sleep. The pain in my chest seemed to have nothing to do with my surgery and everything to do with the realization that was finally sinking in. Jason viewed me as an obligation, not as someone he genuinely cared for. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Thomas Green, the attorney who had handled Edward's estate and had helped me create my will after his passing. The will that currently divided my assets equally between Olivia and Jason, including the lakeside cabin that had been in Edward's family for generations. The cabin that Jason had once loved as a child, but hadn't visited in nearly a decade. It was almost midnight, far too late to call Thomas. But I opened my notes app and began typing, formulating a plan that would either bring my son back to our family or reveal his true priorities once and for all. By the time the night nurse came in to check my vitals at 6 a.m., I had made my decision. The next morning, I asked Olivia to bring me my laptop when she visited. "I need to catch up on some emails," I explained casually. But as soon as she left for lunch, I composed an email to Thomas Green requesting an urgent meeting. "I need to make some changes to my will," I wrote. "It's a matter of some urgency given my recent health concerns." Thomas responded within the hour, expressing concern about my health and offering to come to the hospital the following day. True to his word, he arrived the next afternoon with his briefcase and a sympathetic smile. "Elizabeth," he said warmly, taking the chair beside my hospital bed. "I was so sorry to hear about your heart attack. How are you feeling?" "Physically, I'm improving," I replied. "Emotionally, well, that's part of why I asked you to come. I explained the situation with Jason, trying to keep my voice steady despite the hurt that threatened to overwhelm me every time I thought about his absence. Thomas listened attentively, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "And you, want to change your will because of this?" he asked carefully. "Not exactly," I said. "I want to change it to give him a choice, and to ensure that my wishes for the family cabin are respected." For the next hour, Thomas and I discussed various options. He advised caution, reminding me that changes made while emotionally distraught could lead to regrets later. But I was resolute. "This isn't about punishing Jason," I insisted. "It's about trying to help him remember what's truly important before it's too late." By the time Thomas left, we had a plan in place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He would draft the changes and return in a few days for me to review and sign them. As I watched him leave, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. This wasn't how I had imagined my relationship with my son would turn out, but perhaps it wasn't too late to change course. The next day, as if sensing something was afoot, Jason finally called. Seeing his name on my caller ID sent a flutter of hope through my chest. "Mom," he said, his voice betraying a hint of guilt. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day," I replied, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. "The doctors say I might be able to go home next week." "That's great news," he said with forced enthusiasm. "Listen, I'm sorry I haven't been able to visit. Things have been absolutely crazy here. Vanessa and I are closing on a vacation property in the Hamptons, and the paperwork is a nightmare. Plus, I'm up for a promotion at the firm, so I've been putting in 16-hour days." I closed my eyes, absorbing the impact of his words. A vacation home in the Hamptons took priority over visiting his mother in the hospital. A promotion mattered more than being present during a family health crisis. "I understand you're busy," I said carefully. "But Jason, I nearly died. Don't you think that warrants taking a day or two to come see me?" His sigh was audible. "Mom, don't be dramatic. Olivia said the surgery went well. You're recovering. It's not like you're on your deathbed." His callousness stunned me into silence. "Look," he continued, filling the awkward pause. "Once things settle down, Vanessa and I will come for a proper visit. Maybe in a month or so. We could take you out to that French restaurant you like." "That would be nice," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow. "I should rest now. The physical therapist will be here soon." "Sure, Mom. Take care of yourself. Love you." The call ended, and I stared at the phone in my hand, tears welling in my eyes. It wasn't just that he hadn't visited. It was his complete inability to see why it mattered. The casual dismissal of my feelings, the priorities that placed work and real estate above family, the way he spoke as if doing me a favor by offering a dinner out once things settled down. When Thomas returned 3 days later with the revised will, I signed it without hesitation. "Are you sure about this, Elizabeth?" he asked one last time. "It's quite an unconventional approach." I nodded firmly. "I'm sure, Thomas. Sometimes love means setting difficult terms." That afternoon, when Olivia came to visit, she immediately sensed something had changed. "Mom? What's going on? You seem different." I patted the edge of my bed, inviting her to sit beside me. "I've made some changes to my will," I explained carefully. Her eyes widened. "Because of Jason?" "Because I want to protect what matters most," I corrected gently. "The family cabin has always been special to me, to all of us. Your father would want it to remain in the family, to be used and loved, not sold off to fund a lifestyle." "Jason would sell it?" Olivia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "In a heartbeat," I confirmed. He mentioned yesterday that he and Vanessa are buying a place in the Hamptons. Why would they need a rustic cabin in the mountains when they could have a prestigious beach house instead? Olivia's expression darkened. So you're leaving the cabin to me instead? Not exactly, I said. I've created a family trust. The cabin will belong to all of us. You, me, Jason, and eventually your children. But there are conditions. I explained the terms I had established with Thomas's help. The cabin could never be sold unless all family members unanimously agreed. Each adult family member would be required to spend at least 2 weeks per year at the cabin, participating in its maintenance and care. Anyone who failed to meet this obligation for 2 consecutive years would forfeit their right to use the property and their say in its future. What about the rest of your assets? Olivia asked cautiously. The house will be sold and the proceeds divided equally between you and Jason, I explained. My savings and investments as well. I'm not trying to disinherit him, Olivia. I'm trying to protect something precious, not just the cabin itself, but what it represents. Family, connection, the legacy your father wanted to leave. Olivia was quiet for a long moment. He's going to be furious, she finally said. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps it will be the wake-up call he needs. Jason has always responded to clear boundaries and expectations. Right now, he believes he can have it all, the prestigious career, the wealthy lifestyle, and still maintain his claim on family assets without any of the responsibilities of actually being family. And if he chooses not to participate? If he forfeits his rights? To the cabin? I smiled sadly. Then at least he'll have made his choice consciously, rather than simply letting family connections fade away through neglect. And you and your children will still have the cabin to enjoy and pass down to future generations. Olivia squeezed my hand. I hope it works, Mom. I miss the brother I used to have. So do I whispered. So do I. The following week, I was finally discharged from the hospital. Olivia insisted I stay with her family for the first few weeks of my recovery, and I gratefully accepted. My bedroom was on the first floor, sparing me the need to navigate stairs, and having the twins around lifted my spirits immeasurably. 2 days after I settled into Olivia's home, Thomas called to inform me that the revised will had been properly filed and executed. I've sent the notification letters to both Olivia and Jason as instructed, he added. Jason should receive his tomorrow or the day after. I thanked him and hung up, a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Now we would see how Jason would respond. I didn't have to wait long. The very next evening, my phone rang with Jason's number displayed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. Mom, he began without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. What the hell is this letter about changes to your will? Some kind of trust for the cabin? Mandatory family vacations? Are you serious right now? Hello, Jason, I replied calmly. Yes, I'm quite serious. The cabin is important to me and I want to ensure it remains in the family and is properly used and maintained. This is ridiculous, he exploded. You can't force me to take vacations at that old cabin. Vanessa and I have commitments, a lifestyle that doesn't include mandatory rural retreats. I'm not forcing you to do anything, I pointed out. I'm simply setting conditions for the continued shared ownership of a family property. If those conditions don't align with your priorities, you're free to forfeit your interest in the cabin. Is this because I didn't visit you in the hospital? He demanded. Are you punishing me for having a busy career? Not everyone can drop everything like Olivia. His words stung, but I had anticipated this reaction. This isn't punishment, Jason. It's clarity. For years, you've been drifting away from this family while still expecting to benefit from family assets. I'm simply asking you to make a conscious choice. Participate meaningfully in the family, including the responsibility of maintaining our shared property. or acknowledge that you've chosen a different path. This is emotional manipulation, he accused. No, I countered firmly. Emotional manipulation would be using guilt or threats to force you to visit or call more often. I'm not doing that. I'm simply aligning inheritance with responsibility. The cabin requires care and maintenance. If you want to remain a co-owner, you need to contribute to that care. 2 weeks per year is hardly an unreasonable expectation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I'll contest it, he finally said. I'll get my own lawyer and fight this. You're welcome to try, I said, my heart breaking even as I maintained my resolve. But the trust is legally sound. Thomas assures me of that. Another silence then. I need to think about this. Take all the time you need, I replied gently. The first annual maintenance week isn't until Memorial Day. You have 2 months to decide whether you want to participate. After we hung up, I sat motionless, tears sliding down my cheeks. This wasn't how I had imagined my relationship with my son would evolve. But sometimes love meant making difficult choices, not just for oneself, but for the future of the family. The next morning, Olivia found me sitting at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea and staring out at the garden where the first crocuses were beginning to emerge from the still cold earth. Jason called me last night, she said, pouring herself a coffee and joining me at the table. He was pretty upset. I imagine he was, I replied wearily. Did he try to recruit you to his side? Olivia nodded. He wanted me to convince you to change your mind. Said I was manipulating you while you were vulnerable. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at that. And what did you tell him? I told him he was lucky you didn't cut him out entirely after he couldn't be bothered to visit his mother in the hospital. I told him 2 weeks a year at a beautiful lakeside cabin hardly constituted hardship. And I told him to grow up and start thinking about someone besides himself for a change. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said firmly, because he needed to hear it, and because it's the truth. The weeks that followed were quiet. Jason didn't call again, and I resisted the urge to reach out to him. This had to be his decision, made without pressure or guilt. My cardiac rehabilitation progressed well, and by April, I was back in my own home, resuming most of my normal activities with just a few modifications. As Memorial Day approached, the date I had designated for the first annual cabin maintenance week, I tried to prepare myself for the possibility that Jason wouldn't show up, that he would forfeit his rights to the cabin rather than spend 2 weeks each year with family. The thought was painful, but I had made peace with it as a potential outcome. The Saturday morning of Memorial Day weekend, Olivia, Mike, and the Yai twins picked me up, their SUV loaded with supplies for the week at the cabin. The drive to the Adirondacks was filled with the twins' excited chatter about fishing and swimming and making s'mores by the campfire. As we turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, Olivia suddenly gasped, "Mom, look!" There, parked in front of the cabin, was a sleek black Tesla. And sitting on the porch steps, looking somewhat out of place in designer jeans and a button-down shirt, was Jason. He stood as we approached, his expression a mixture of defensiveness and uncertainty. When I stepped out of the car, he hesitated for just a moment before crossing the distance between us and wrapping me in a careful hug. "The doctor said no heavy lifting for you," he said gruffly. "So I got here early to air the place out and stock the fridge." I blinked back tears, suddenly unable to speak. "I'm still mad about the will," he added, pulling back to look at me. "But Vanessa and I talked it over and, well, she pointed out that I haven't been very present lately, for you or for anyone in the family." The twins had scrambled out of the car and were now racing toward Jason, shouting, "Uncle Jason! Uncle Jason!" With unbridled enthusiasm, he knelt down to greet them, looking almost startled by their affection. "Hey, Munchkins, you've gotten so big since I last saw you." "That's because it's been almost 2 years," Olivia remarked pointedly as she approached, though her expression softened as she watched her children with their uncle. Jason winced. Yeah, I've been busy. Too busy for family? I asked. Quietly. He met my gaze, a flicker of shame crossing his features. I thought I was building something important. The career, the connections, the lifestyle. But when Vanessa asked me what I was actually working toward, what the end goal was, I realized I didn't really know. The twins had already disappeared. Into the cabin, their excited voices echoing as they explored. Anyway, Jason continued, we're here for the week, both of us. Vanessa's inside making lunch. She's, not much of a cook, but she's trying. I glanced toward the cabin in surprise. Vanessa came too? Jason nodded. Her idea, actually. Said if this place was important enough for you to create a whole trust around it, she wanted to understand why. As we walked toward the cabin together, Jason's hand resting lightly on my arm in a protective gesture I hadn't felt from him in years, I didn't know what the future held for our family. Whether this was a temporary reconciliation or the beginning of a genuine reconnection. But standing on the porch of the cabin that had witnessed 4 generations of our family's history, watching my daughter and son tentatively rebuilding their bond as the twins darted excitedly between them, I knew I had made the right decision. Sometimes, the most important changes in a will aren't about money or property at all. They're about legacy, connection, and remembering what truly matters, before it's too late. The days that followed at the cabin were a delicate dance of reconnection. I watched as Jason awkwardly reacquainted himself with the rhythms of our family gatherings, sometimes retreating behind his phone when conversations became too personal, but increasingly present as the week progressed. Vanessa surprised me most of all. I had always perceived her as aloof and materialistic, judgments I now realized were unfair and based on limited interaction. As we prepared dinner together on the 3rd evening, she confided in me while chopping vegetables for a salad. I never knew about your heart attack, Elizabeth, she said quietly, her normally perfect composure slipping just a bit. Jason told me you were having some minor tests done. When Olivia called me directly and explained how serious it had been, I was horrified. I paused, wooden spoon mid-stir in the pot of stew I was preparing. He didn't tell you? She shook, her head, precise movements slicing through a cucumber. No. And it wasn't the first time. Last Christmas, when he said we couldn't visit because I had the flu, I was perfectly healthy. We were actually at a ski resort in Aspen with my college friends. The revelation stung, even though it shouldn't have surprised me. Why are you telling me this now? Vanessa set down her knife and turned to face me fully. Because I love your son, but I don't like what he's becoming. The constant working, the status chasing, the disconnection from what matters. That's not the man I married. She twisted the diamond wedding band on her finger. When your letter about the will changes arrived, he was furious, but it made me think about our priorities, about the life we're building. I started asking questions, and I didn't like many of the answers. I wasn't sure how to respond. This woman, whom I had mentally cast as a co-conspirator in my son's distancing, was suddenly revealing herself as a potential ally. The cabin is beautiful, she added, gesturing toward the window where the late afternoon sun glittered on the lake. I can see why you've made it a priority to preserve it. It's not just the cabin, I said softly. It's what happens here. The connections, the memories, the way time slows down and we remember who we are to each other. Vanessa nodded, a wistful expression crossing her face. I never had anything like this growing up. Despite all the money, my family never vacationed together. We were always sent away to camps or with nannies while my parents traveled separately. She picked up her knife again, resuming her methodical chopping. Maybe that's why I didn't value this place. I didn't understand what it represented. Our conversation was interrupted by the twins bursting through the door, damp from swimming and ravenous as only children can be after an afternoon of activity. Behind them came Olivia, Mike and Jason, all laughing about some mishap involving a rowboat and a particularly determined duck. Jason caught my eye across the room, his smile faltering slightly as he noticed Vanessa and me in what was obviously a serious conversation. But before he could intervene, the twins were tugging him toward the bathroom, insisting he help them wash up before dinner. "He can be a good uncle," Vanessa observed quietly as we watched them go, "when he remembers to try." The remainder of the week unfolded with a cautious warming. Jason set about repairing the dock with Mike, clearly uncomfortable with the physical labor at first, but gradually finding satisfaction in the work. I caught him one evening sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the lake with a pensive expression. That reminded me so much of his father it made my heart ache. "Penny, for your thoughts?" I asked, settling into the chair beside him. He started slightly, then relaxed. "Just thinking about Dad. Remember how he used to get up at dawn to fish? He'd be out there in that old rowboat before anyone else was awake. And he'd come back with enough trout for breakfast every time," I added, smiling at the memory. "I haven't been here since before he died," Jason admitted, guilt edging his voice. 5 years. More than that, actually. "I know. I told myself it was because I was busy, building my career, establishing ourselves in Boston." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Edward that it made my breath catch. "But that wasn't it. Not really." I waited, giving him space to continue. "It hurt too much," he finally said. "Being here without him, everything reminds me of Dad." The fishing tackle still arranged exactly as he left it. His favorite chair, the way the light hits the kitchen table in the morning. He swallowed hard. "I thought it would be easier to just create something new, a different life that didn't have those empty spaces." The admission startled me. All this time, I had attributed Jason's absence to selfishness, to ambition and materialism. I hadn't considered that he might be avoiding pain rather than responsibility. "I miss him too," I said gently. "Every day. But being here, where we were happy together, helps me feel connected to him still. Like he's not completely gone." Jason nodded, blinking rapidly. "I'm starting to see that. I think I've been running from the wrong things." As the week drew to a close, an unspoken question hung in the air. Was this reconciliation temporary, or the beginning of a real change? On our final evening, after the twins had been tucked into bed and Mike and Olivia had retired to their room, Jason, Vanessa, and I sat around the fire pit by the lake's edge, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. "So," Jason began hesitantly, "about the trust conditions." I tensed, bracing myself for a negotiation or protest. 2 weeks a year seems reasonable," he continued, surprising me. "But I'm not sure we can do it all at once, with our work schedules." He trailed off, glancing at Vanessa. "What if we did 1 week in the summer and 1 week in the winter?" she suggested. "Maybe we could all spend Christmas here, start a new tradition?" The suggestion was so unexpected, so contrary to their usual holiday plans involving exclusive resorts or European destinations, that for a moment I couldn't respond. "Unless that doesn't work for everyone else," Jason added quickly, misinterpreting my silence. "No," I managed, emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "Christmas would be wonderful. Your father always loved the cabin in winter. The frozen lake, snow on the pines." "I remember," Jason said softly. "He used to drag that ancient toboggan up the hill behind the cabin over and over, never tiring of taking me for rides." "I didn't know that," Vanessa said, looking at him with a gentle curiosity. "You never talk about your childhood." "There's a lot I haven't talked about," Jason acknowledged. "A lot I've been trying to outrun." He turned to me, his expression more open than I had seen it in years. I can't promise that everything will change overnight. My job is still demanding, and we've built a life in Boston that can't just be abandoned. But I want to try. To be more present. To remember what matters. That's all I've ever wanted, I told him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Not perfection. Just effort. Connection. As we drove back to Burlington the following day, the car considerably quieter with the twins napping in the back after the excitement of the week, Olivia glanced at me from the driver's seat. "So," she said softly, "do you think it worked? Your will strategy?" I gazed out at the passing landscape, considering the question. "It's a beginning," I finally answered. "Not a solution, but a beginning." For the next several months, I saw subtle but encouraging signs of change. Jason called at least once a week, brief conversations sometimes, but consistent. In July, he and Vanessa surprised us by joining a weekend family barbecue, driving up from Boston with hardly any notice. When my birthday came in September, instead of the usual delivery of an elaborate flower arrangement, Jason arrived in person, taking me to lunch and presenting me with a photo album he had created. Images from the cabin through the years, some I hadn't seen in decades, carefully preserved and annotated in his handwriting. "Where did you find all these?" I asked, turning the pages with wonder. "Dad had a box of old photos in his study," Jason explained. "I took them after he died, thinking I'd organize them someday. They've been sitting in my closet for 5 years. He shrugged, a bit embarrassed. It felt like time. As promised, Jason and Vanessa returned to the cabin for a week in August, this time without the buffer of Olivia's family. We spent days fishing, hiking, and simply sitting on the dock with books, rediscovering the pleasure of unhurried conversation. One evening, as Jason helped me clear away dinner dishes, he broached a subject I hadn't expected. "Mom, I've been thinking about the trust," he began, carefully drawing a serving bowl. "The way it's set up now, if Vanessa and I have children someday, they'd inherit my share of the cabin." "Yes," I confirmed. "That was always the intention, to keep the cabin in the family for generations." He nodded thoughtfully. "But what? About Olivia's kids?" "The way it's structured, the ownership would become increasingly fragmented as more descendants come along. Eventually, there could be dozens of partial owners, making decisions impossible." I paused, surprised by his foresight. This was a potential complication Thomas had mentioned, one I had acknowledged but not fully addressed in my rush to create the trust. "You've given this some thought," I observed. "I have," he admitted. "And I was wondering if we might revisit the trust structure. Not to change the core intention, but to ensure the cabin truly remains viable as a family gathering place for generations to come." The following week, Jason arranged a meeting with Thomas and a trust specialist from his own firm. Together, we restructured the family trust to create a more sustainable model. The cabin would be held by the trust in perpetuity, with family members serving as trustees rather than fractional owners. The obligation to participate in maintenance and use of the property remained, but the governance structure was simplified to prevent the complications of multiple inheritance branches over time. "This is impressive work," Thomas commented as we finalized the documents. "Much more forward-thinking than our original structure." "I want to make sure we're setting this up to succeed," Jason explained. "Not just for our generation, but beyond." I couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The son who had once been so focused on his own ambitions was now thinking about family legacy in terms of decades and generations. As October turned the forest around the cabin into a blaze of crimson and gold, we gathered once more, this time for a purpose both solemn and hopeful. On what would have been Edward's 70th birthday, we scattered a portion of his ashes in the lake he had loved so much. It was Jason who had suggested the ceremony, recognizing that although the formal funeral had taken place years ago, this more intimate family farewell was something we all needed. Standing on the dock, the four of us plus the twins, we each shared memories of Edward, the serious and the silly, the profound and the everyday moments that had shaped our lives. When it was Jason's turn, he spoke with a rawness he had never before allowed himself. "Dad taught me how to cast a fishing line right here," he said, voice thick with emotion. I was maybe 6 years old, impatient and frustrated because I couldn't get it right. After about the 10th tangle, I threw down the rod and declared I was giving up. Dad just looked at me and said, "That's your choice, son, but the fish are still out there waiting, whether you try again or not." Jason paused, collecting himself. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how many things I've given up on because they were difficult or uncomfortable, about what might still be waiting if I'm willing to try again." He looked around at all of us, his gaze lingering on me. "I'm trying again now, Dad. I hope you can see that." When the ceremony concluded, the twins, sensing the need to restore lightness, convinced everyone to join them for one last swim of the season. The October water was breathtakingly cold, but there was something cleansing in the shock of it, something that left us all laughing and newly bonded as we huddled afterward in blankets on the shore, drinking hot chocolate as the sun began its descent. As promised, we all returned to the cabin for Christmas. The place was transformed by winter, the lake frozen into a gleaming expanse of white, the surrounding forest hushed under a thick blanket of snow. Jason and Mike spent hours clearing a skating rink on the lake, while Vanessa revealed an unexpected talent for baking, filling the cabin with the aromas of gingerbread and cinnamon. On Christmas morning, after the chaos of presents had subsided, and the twins were absorbed in their new toys, Jason handed me a small, carefully wrapped package. "This isn't your main gift," he explained as I turned it over curiously. "That's under the tree, but this felt like something to give you privately." Inside was a key on a simple silver keychain. I looked at him, confused. "It's to our new place," he explained. "Vanessa and I sold the condo in downtown Boston. We've bought a house in the suburbs instead. It's smaller, nothing fancy, but it has a guest room that's yours whenever you want it. No more excuses about why you can't visit." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, not just the key itself, but what it represented, brought tears to my eyes. "You didn't have to move because of me," I managed. "It wasn't just for you," Vanessa interjected, joining us by the window. "It was for us, too. The condo was part of a lifestyle that wasn't making us happy. Always on display, always performing." She exchanged a glance with Jason before continuing. "We've been reassessing a lot of things." "Such as?" I prompted. Gently. "Work for one," Jason said. "I've turned down the promotion we discussed, the one I was working 16-hour days to secure." "Jason," I began, concerned, "I never meant for you to sacrifice your career." He held up a hand, stopping me. "It's not a sacrifice. The promotion would have meant even more travel, even less time for anything outside of work. I'm not leaving. The firm, just choosing a different path within it. One that might lead to partnership more slowly, but will let me actually have a life in the meantime." It was a profound shift from the son who had once measured his worth almost exclusively through professional advancement and material acquisition. Watching him throughout that Christmas week, building snowmen with the twins, reconnecting with his sister through late-night conversations by the fire, even simply sitting quietly with a book and no electronic devices in sight, I saw glimpses of the thoughtful, present person he was capable of being when not consumed by external validation. On New Year's Eve, as we all gathered on the frozen lake at midnight, sparklers in hand to welcome the coming year under a canopy of stars, I found myself overwhelmed with gratitude. Not because everything was perfect. There were still moments of tension, old patterns that reasserted themselves, work emails that occasionally drew Jason's attention away. But because we were here, together, trying. As we returned to the cabin, Cheeks flushed from cold and celebration, Jason hung back, falling into step beside me on the snowy path. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For finding a way to wake me up before it was too late." He looked toward the cabin, windows glowing with warm light, silhouettes of our family visible through the glass. I almost lost this. Almost didn't even realize what I was losing. Linked my arm through his, this son who had once felt so distant and now stood beside me, imperfect but present. That's what mothers do. We find ways to guide our children home, even when the path seems lost. The months that followed brought continued evolution in our family dynamics. Jason and Vanessa became more integrated into our regular gatherings, not just the obligatory visits to the cabin. When spring arrived, bringing with it my first full cardiac checkup since the surgery, it was Jason who insisted on accompanying me to the appointment. Sitting in the cardiologist's waiting room, he fidgeted nervously with a magazine. "What if something's wrong?" he asked, revealing a vulnerability I rarely saw. "What if the bypass hasn't held? Or there's new blockage?" "Then we'll deal with it," I assured him, touched by his concern. But Dr. Chen seems optimistic based on my recent tests. When Dr. Chen called us in and confirmed that my recovery was progressing exactly as hoped, the relief on Jason's face was palpable. As we left the medical center, he surprised me by pulling me into a tight hug right there in the parking lot. "Promise me something," he said, voice muffled against my shoulder. "Promise you'll tell me right away if you ever don't feel well. No downplaying symptoms. No, not wanting to worry me. I want to know." "I promise," I said, blinking back tears, at this evidence of his renewed commitment to being a present son. "As long as you promise not to hover and treat me like I'm made of glass." He laughed, releasing me. "Deal. No hovering. Just appropriate concern from a son who doesn't want to waste any more time." That summer marked 1 year since my heart attack and the subsequent changes to my will. As August drew to a close, with another successful cabin week behind us, I found myself reflecting on the journey. The changes in Jason were real and sustained, not a temporary performance to secure his inheritance, but a genuine shift in priorities and perspective. One evening in early September, as I sat on my porch enjoying the transition to fall, a familiar Tesla pulled into my driveway. Jason emerged, not with his usual purposeful stride, but slowly, almost hesitantly. I waited, sensing he had something important to discuss. "I didn't call first," he said as he approached. "I hope that's okay." "You never need to call first," I assured him, patting the chair beside me. "Everything all right?" He sat, gazing out at the garden for a long moment before responding. "Vanessa's pregnant." Joy surged through me, but I contained it, reading the complex emotions on his face. "And how do you feel about that?" "Terrified," he admitted with a short laugh. Excited, overwhelmed. We weren't planning it, not yet. But the test is positive, and we had it confirmed at the doctor yesterday." "Congratulations," I said softly, reaching for his hand. "You're going to be wonderful parents." He shook his head, doubt clouding his features. "How can you be so sure? A year ago, I was barely functioning as a son, let alone prepared to be someone's father." "Because I've watched you grow," I told him simply. "I've seen how you've reconnected with what matters, how you've learned to balance ambition with presence. Those are exactly the qualities a child needs in their father." "I keep thinking about Dad," Jason confessed, "about what he would say if he were here." "He would be overjoyed," I said without hesitation. "And he would tell you that you already have everything you need to be an excellent father. The rest you'll learn as you go, just like we all do." Jason nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "We're thinking of moving back to Burlington once the baby comes. The Boston suburbs are fine, but they're not home. Not really. And the idea, of raising our child near family, near you and Olivia and the twins." He trailed off, then added, "Vanessa's on board." More than on board, actually. It was partly her idea. The news that my son, who had once been so determined to escape his hometown for more prestigious surroundings, now wanted to return, filled me with quiet happiness. Not because it validated my choices or proved I had been right, but because it suggested he had found his own way to what truly mattered. "We'd like you to be very involved," he continued. "Not just as a grandmother who visits occasionally, but as a regular, consistent presence in our child's life, if that's something you want." "There's nothing I would want more," I assured him, squeezing his hand. As the autumn light faded around us, conversation flowing easily about nursery plans and possible neighborhoods, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From a hospital bed, hurt and uncertain, I had made a decision that could have permanently alienated my son. Instead, it had ultimately brought him back, not just physically, but emotionally. The will change had been a risk, a last attempt to reach a son who seemed determined to drift away. But sometimes, I realized, love requires courage. The courage to set boundaries, to create consequences, to insist on what matters most, not out of punitiveness, but out of profound hope that connections can be restored before it's too late. When Jason left that evening, promising to bring Vanessa for dinner the following weekend, I remained on the porch watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. My heart, physically strengthened by surgery, emotionally tested and ultimately renewed, felt full in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. The will change had never really been about the cabin or legal conditions or inheritance. It had been about legacy in its truest sense, the values, connections, and priorities we pass to the next generation. Through an unexpected medical crisis and one carefully considered legal document, I had found a way to remind my son of the inheritance that mattered most of all: the sustaining power of family bonds, strong enough to survive absence, resilient enough to allow for return. As I finally rose to go inside, I smiled at the thought of a new grandchild who would never know the disconnected version of their father. They would know only the Jason who had found his way back, to his family, to his core values, and ultimately to himself. Sometimes I reflected as I closed my door against the gathering chill, the most meaningful changes we make aren't to legal documents at all, but to the hearts that those documents simply serve to awaken. The autumn leaves had just begun their transformation when Vanessa's morning sickness started in earnest. What had initially been mild discomfort escalated into debilitating nausea that left her bedridden some mornings. Jason called me in a panic one Tuesday in late October. "Mom, I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice tight with worry. "She can't keep anything down. The doctor says it's normal, but this doesn't seem normal." "I'll be there in an hour," I told him, already reaching for my purse and car keys. The drive to their new home in the Boston suburbs gave me time to reflect on this new chapter of our relationship. A year ago, Jason would never have called me for help with something so personal. He would have hired a nurse or a concierge doctor, someone who could be paid to solve the problem without emotional entanglement. His willingness to reach out, to be vulnerable enough to admit he didn't have all the answers, represented progress I hadn't dared hope for when I'd made those changes to my will. Their house was a revelation after the sleek downtown condo I'd visited only twice in 5 years. A modest colonial on a tree-lined street, it had the lived-in warmth of a real home rather than the sterile perfection of a showcase. The lawn needed mowing, and a row of half-planted bulbs suggested gardening interrupted by illness. Jason met me at the door, unshaven and clearly exhausted. "Thank you for coming," he said, embracing me briefly before leading me upstairs. "The doctor prescribed some medication yesterday, but it doesn't seem to be helping much yet." I found Vanessa pale and drawn against the pillows, a half-empty glass of water and some saltine crackers on the bedside table. When she saw me, her composed facade crumbled slightly. "Elizabeth," she said, attempting a smile, "I'm sorry you had to come all this way." "Nonsense," I replied, setting down my overnight bag and immediately assessing the situation with the eyes of a mother who had nursed 2 children through countless illnesses. "Let's get you more comfortable." Over the next 2 days, I fell into the rhythm of caring for Vanessa, finding the few foods she could tolerate, making sure she stayed hydrated, adjusting the room to control the smells that triggered her nausea. Jason watched me with a mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like awe. "How do you know all this?" he asked the second evening as we sat in the kitchen, Vanessa finally sleeping peacefully upstairs. "Experience," I told him simply. "And your grandmother's wisdom. She stayed with us when I was pregnant with you, remember? The same thing happened. Terrible morning sickness. She had all these little tricks." Jason shook his head. "I don't remember that. You never told me." "There's a lot I haven't told you," I admitted. "About those early years, about the challenges. Your father and I always presented a united, capable front. Perhaps too capable sometimes." "Meaning?" "Meaning we never let you see how hard things could be. How much we sometimes struggled or doubted ourselves." I took a sip of my tea, considering my words carefully. I wonder now if that was a mistake. If it gave you the impression that adulthood, marriage, parenthood, that all of it should come naturally, without uncertainty or difficulty. Jason was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug between his palms. "I always thought you and Dad had it all figured out," he finally said. "That there was some secret manual on how to do life right, and somehow I'd missed receiving my copy." The admission made my heart ache. How much pressure had he put on himself all these years, trying to project the same kind of unflappable competence he believed his parents had possessed? "There's no manual," I assured him gently. "Just people doing their best, making mistakes, and hopefully learning from them." "Well, I'm making plenty of mistakes to learn from," he said with a rueful smile. "That's how it works." We sat in companionable silence for a while, the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional passing car the only sounds. It struck me that this was perhaps the first truly comfortable silence Jason and I had shared in years. No phones, no distractions, no undercurrents of tension or unspoken expectations. "Vanessa and I have been talking," Jason said eventually, "about moving back to Burlington sooner rather than later, before the baby comes." I tried to keep my expression neutral, not wanting to influence his decision with my obvious happiness at the prospect. "Oh?" "The commute would be longer for me, but I'm working remotely 3 days a week now anyway. And her firm has an office in Burlington, smaller than the Boston headquarters, but they've been wanting to expand the regional presence." He shrugged, a gesture reminiscent of his teenage years. "Plus, having family nearby when the baby arrives, it just makes sense." "Oh, you know we'd all love to have you closer," I said carefully. "But it's a big decision. Are you sure Vanessa is on board, especially with how difficult the pregnancy has been so far?" "Actually, she's the one pushing for it," Jason admitted. "She's more worried about doing this alone than she lets on. Her own mother is in Arizona, remarried, not exactly the nurturing grandmother type." He hesitated, then added, "She admires you, you know, more than she'd probably admit out loud." The revelation surprised me. I had always assumed Vanessa viewed me as a quaint relic of a different era, someone to be tolerated rather than emulated. "Well," I said, gathering our empty mugs and rising from the table, "whatever you decide, I'm here to help however I can." Without overstepping, I added with a smile. Jason laughed, the sound warming the kitchen. "Now that I've seen how you transformed, our bedroom into a pregnancy survival station within hours of arriving. I'm pretty sure we want you to step wherever necessary." By the time I left 3 days later, Vanessa was feeling well enough to join us for a light dinner, and plans for their potential move to Burlington had solidified from a someday possibility to a concrete goal for early spring. As Jason walked me to my car, he hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from his pocket. "I was going to mail this, but since you're here..." He handed it to me with an uncharacteristic shyness. Inside was a grainy black and white image, their first ultrasound. Below it, in Jason's precise handwriting, "Baby Wilson, coming May 15th, already loved beyond measure." "We only had the scan yesterday," he explained, watching my face. "Everything looks good. Strong heartbeat, developing right on schedule." I traced a finger over the blurry image, this first glimpse of a new life that connected us all. "Thank you for sharing this with me." "There's something else," Jason added, shifting his weight nervously. "We'd like you to help us with the nursery. At the new house in Burlington, we're putting in an offer tomorrow on a place about 10 minutes from you. It needs some work, but it has good bones, a yard for the baby to play in eventually." "I'd be honored," I told him, carefully tucking the ultrasound into my purse. "And," he continued, "we've been thinking about names. If it's a boy, we'd like to name him Edward, after Dad." The simple statement, delivered so casually, brought tears to my eyes. After years of Jason seemingly determined to distance himself from his roots, from the father whose absence had wounded him so deeply, this gesture of connection and remembrance felt like a circle closing. "Your father would be so touched," I managed to say. Jason nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I've been reading his old letters, the ones he wrote to me when I first went to college. Did you know he saved every single one of my emails? Printed them out and kept them in a folder in his desk." I hadn't known, but it didn't surprise me. Edward had always been the more sentimental of us, the keeper of mementos and marker of milestones. In one letter, Jason continued, he wrote about how becoming a father was the greatest adventure of his life, how nothing, not his career achievements, not any material success, compared to the feeling of holding me for the first time. He swallowed hard. I didn't appreciate those words when I first read them. I was too busy trying to become something else, someone who measured success differently. "And now?" I prompted gently. "Now I'm starting to understand what he meant," Jason said simply. "And I don't want to miss any more of the adventure than I already have." As the holiday season approached, preparations for Jason and Vanessa's move back to Burlington kicked into high gear. They had secured a charming craftsman-style home on Elm Street, just a short drive from both my house and Olivia's. The timing was fortunate. They would be settled well before Vanessa entered her 3rd trimester, giving them plenty of time to prepare the nursery and adjust to their new surroundings. True to our commitment, we all gathered at the cabin for Christmas. This year felt different from the last, the tentative reconnection having deepened into something more secure. The trust and its conditions, once a point of contention, were now rarely mentioned. Not because they had been forgotten, but because they had been integrated into our family rhythm, the seasonal gatherings at the cabin now anticipated rather than obligatory. On Christmas Eve, as snowflakes drifted past the windows and pine-scented candles filled the cabin with warmth, Jason gathered everyone's attention by gently tapping his glass. "Vanessa and I have something we'd like to share," he announced, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Vanessa, whose pregnancy now showed clearly beneath her festive sweater, smiled up at him with an encouraging nod. "We've had the 20-week scan," Jason continued, "and everything looks perfect with the baby. We're having a girl." The announcement was met with delighted exclamations, Olivia's twins immediately launching into a debate about what their new cousin should be called. "We've already chosen a name," Vanessa added once the initial excitement had quieted. Elizabeth Ann, after her grandmother. I froze, teacup halfway to my lips, certain I had misheard. "We wanted to honor you, Mom," Jason said, his gaze meeting mine across the room. "For everything you've taught us, not just this past year, but throughout our lives. Even when I wasn't listening, you were teaching. About resilience, about what matters, about how to find your way back when you've lost the path." The room blurred as tears filled my eyes. Olivia crossed to wrap me in a fierce hug, whispering, "See? Your plan worked better than you could have imagined." Later that night, unable to sleep with all the emotions of the day still swirling, I stood at the cabin window watching moonlight transform the snow-covered landscape into a silver dreamscape. Soft footsteps behind me announced Jason's presence before he spoke. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, coming to stand beside me. I shook my head. "Too much joy to contain. It keeps bubbling up and waking me." He smiled at that. "I know the feeling." We stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, the moonlight casting long shadows across the frozen lake. "I've been thinking about something," Jason said eventually, "about why your change to the will affected me so deeply." I turned to look at him, curious. "It wasn't the cabin itself," he continued thoughtfully, "or even the conditions you set. It was that, for the first time in a long time, you weren't just accepting whatever scraps of attention I was willing to give. You were saying that our relationship, this family, had value. Enough value to be worth fighting for, worth setting boundaries around." The insight surprised me. In my darkest moments after making the change, I had feared I was simply being punitive, using the only leverage I had to force my son's attention. I had never considered that the very act of creating consequences might communicate something essential about worth and care. "I think I needed that," Jason admitted. "Needed to be reminded that some things are worth more than convenience or career advancement, that some bonds can't just be maintained with flowers and occasional phone calls." "I was afraid I might lose you entirely," I confessed, "that you'd simply walk away rather than meet the conditions." "I considered it," he acknowledged honestly. "That first day when I got the letter, I was furious. Told Vanessa we should just write off the cabin, let Olivia have it." He smiled ruefully. "She's the one who made me really think about what that would mean. About what I'd be giving up. Not just a piece of property, but a connection to my past, my future, my family identity." "I've always underestimated Vanessa," I admitted. Jason laughed softly. "Most people do. She's not demonstrative in the way Olivia is, but she sees things clearly, understands what matters." He touched my shoulder gently. "She's the one who pointed out that your heart attack wasn't just a health crisis. It was a wake-up call to all of us about the time we might be wasting." In the silvery darkness of the cabin, with everyone else asleep and the world outside hushed beneath its blanket of snow, the conversation felt almost dreamlike, a space outside of normal time, where truths could be spoken without fear or judgment. "When the baby comes," Jason said after another comfortable silence, "I want her to know this place from the beginning. To grow up understanding that home isn't just about physical walls, but about the connections between people, the traditions that bind us, the places that hold our collective memories." "That's exactly what your father and I hoped for," I told him, my voice thick with emotion. "When we first brought you and Olivia here as children, that you would understand you were part of something larger than yourselves, something that existed before you and would continue after." Jason nodded, his profile silvered by moonlight in a way that made him look uncannily like Edward. "I get it now. It just took me a while." As winter slowly yielded to spring, Jason and Vanessa settled into their Burlington home with remarkable ease. The house itself required more work than they had initially anticipated. Plumbing issues, electrical updates, a roof that leaked during the first major thaw. But they approached each challenge with a patience and good humor that would have been unimaginable in the Jason of a year before. "It's character building," he joked one Saturday afternoon as he and Mike attempted to repair the ancient garbage disposal, while Olivia and I helped Vanessa sort through boxes of baby clothes that had arrived from various relatives. "That's what Dad would say, right? These old houses teach you perseverance." The nursery became our shared project, a soothing space with pale green walls, white furniture, and a hand-painted mural of forest animals that Olivia and I worked on while Vanessa was at prenatal appointments. Jason installed bookshelves and filled them with the same stories he and Olivia had loved as children, carefully preserved copies that I had saved all these years in anticipation of grandchildren. "I can't believe you kept all these," he marveled, running a finger along the spine of Goodnight Moon. "Some of them look brand new." "I always hoped they'd be read again someday," I told him simply. The weeks passed in a flurry of preparation and anticipation. Vanessa bloomed in her second trimester, the severe morning sickness finally abating, replaced by an energetic nesting instinct that had her organizing and reorganizing the nursery on an almost daily basis. Her relationship with Olivia deepened into genuine friendship, the two of them discovering shared interests in gardening and historical fiction that transcended their very different personalities. In late April, just 3 weeks before her due date, Vanessa developed preeclampsia, a dangerous spike in blood pressure that put both her and the baby at risk. Her doctor ordered immediate bed rest and close monitoring, with the possibility of early delivery if her condition worsened. Jason called me in a panic from the hospital after their routine appointment had turned into an emergency admission. "They're keeping her overnight for observation," he explained, his voice tight with fear. "They've given her medication to bring the blood pressure down, but if it doesn't stabilize—" "I'm on my way," I assured him. "Have you called Olivia?" "Not yet. I didn't want to worry her unnecessarily." "Jason," I interrupted gently, "this is exactly when family should be worried together. Call your sister. Let her help." By the time I arrived at the hospital, Olivia was already there, her nursing background enabling her to interpret the medical jargon and advocate for additional monitoring that the overworked hospital staff might have overlooked. Jason paced the corridor outside Vanessa's room, alternating between intense conversations with doctors and moments of silent, rigid terror. "She's going to be okay," I told him, guiding him to a quiet corner of the waiting area. "They caught it early, and she's getting excellent care." "But what if—" "No what ifs right now," I said firmly. "Just one moment at a time." For the next 3 days, we maintained a rotating vigil at the hospital. Vanessa's condition stabilized enough to avoid immediate delivery, but the doctors were clear that the baby would likely need to be delivered early to protect Vanessa's health. Jason barely left her side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and working remotely when he could focus enough to do so. On the morning of the 4th day, Vanessa's blood pressure spiked dangerously despite the medication, and the decision was made to perform an emergency C-section. Jason called me from the pre-op area, his voice shaking. "It's happening now," he said simply. "They're prepping her for surgery. We'll be there," I promised. "Your sister and I are already on our way." The 3 hours that followed were among the longest of my life. Olivia and I sat in the surgical waiting area, alternating between nervous conversation and anxious silence. When Jason finally appeared, still in surgical scrubs and looking simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, we both stood immediately. "She's here," he announced, voice cracking with emotion. 5 pounds, 3 ounces. Small but perfect. They've taken her to the NICU for monitoring because she's a few weeks early, but her lungs are functioning well, and all her vital signs are strong." "And Vanessa?" Olivia asked urgently. "Stable," Jason replied, relief evident in his posture. "The surgery went smoothly. They're monitoring her closely, but the doctor expects a full recovery." He led us to the NICU, where a nurse helped us scrub in before we could approach the incubator containing the tiny, perfect form of Elizabeth Ann Wilson. My granddaughter, so small, yet already so complete, with Jason's nose and what looked like Vanessa's delicate mouth. Jason reached carefully into the incubator through the special access ports, his large hand dwarfing the infant's entire body as he gently stroked her arm with one finger. "Elizabeth," he whispered reverently, "we've been waiting for you." I watched my son, this man who had once been so disconnected from his family roots that he couldn't make time to visit his hospitalized mother, now completely absorbed in the miracle of his daughter's arrival, and marveled at the journey we had all taken to reach this moment. Later that evening, after Vanessa had been settled in her recovery room and little Elizabeth had been deemed stable enough for brief visits outside the NICU, I found myself alone with my granddaughter for a precious few minutes. The nurse had placed her in my arms, showing me how to support her tiny body while navigating the monitoring wires that still connected her to the NICU equipment. "Hello, little one," I murmured, studying her perfect features. "I'm your grandmother. We've got quite a story already, you and I." The infant's eyes, unfocused but alert, seemed to study my face with solemn concentration. "Your daddy has come a long way to meet you," I continued softly. "Sometimes people get lost for a while, even good people who love each other very much. But that doesn't mean they can't find their way back." Little Elizabeth's tiny hand escaped from her swaddling, 5 perfect fingers splayed against the soft blanket. I gently touched one finger to her palm, feeling the instinctive grip that connected us across generations. "You're going to grow up surrounded by so much love," I promised her, "with parents who understand what matters, and a family that knows the value of showing up for each other. We had to learn some hard lessons to get here, but that just makes this moment all the sweeter." The door opened quietly, and Jason appeared, his expression softening as he saw us together. "Mom, talking your ear off already, little one?" he teased gently, coming to stand beside the rocking chair where I sat. "Just introducing myself properly," I replied, sharing some family wisdom. Jason placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch conveying gratitude and connection that required no words. "The nurses need to take her back to the NICU for her feeding," he explained reluctantly, "but they said we can visit again in a couple of hours." As I carefully handed my granddaughter to the waiting nurse, I felt a profound sense of completion, not an ending, but a circle connecting past to future in the most tangible way possible. Later that night, as Jason and I shared a quiet moment in the hospital cafeteria while Olivia sat with Vanessa, he surprised me with a question that revealed how much he had been reflecting on our journey. "Do you think Dad somehow knew?" he asked, absently stirring a cup of cooling coffee. "When he set up the trust for the cabin originally, making sure it would stay in the family, do you think he sensed that I might drift away someday? That we might need something concrete to pull me back?" I considered the question carefully. Edward had always had an intuitive understanding of our children, sometimes seeing aspects of their characters that were still developing long before they became apparent to anyone else. "I think your father understood that families need anchors," I said finally. "Physical places that hold memories and create continuity across generations. I don't know if he specifically foresaw your path, but he certainly understood the human tendency to get caught up in the current of individual ambition and lose sight of the harbor of family connection." Jason nodded thoughtfully. "When I was finalizing the transfer of our Boston condo last month, the real estate agent asked why we were downsizing, moving away from the city just as my career was advancing. I found myself telling her about the cabin, about how it had been in the family for generations, about how I wanted my daughter to have the same connection to place and family that I'd experienced growing up." He smiled ruefully. "She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. In her world, you always move up, move on, trade the old for the newer and better. The idea of valuing continuity over status was completely alien to her. And To you, not so long ago, I observed gently. And to me, he acknowledged with a self-deprecating laugh. Amazing how quickly priorities can shift when you're faced with what really matters. We sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the hushed sounds of the hospital at night creating a cocoon around our conversation. I've been thinking about something else too, Jason said eventually. About how close I came to missing all of this. If you hadn't changed your will after the heart attack, if you had just accepted my absence and distance as the new normal, I might never have reconnected meaningfully with you or Olivia, might never have reprioritized my life, in time to be truly present for Elizabeth's arrival. The thought sent a chill through me, despite the overheated cafeteria. How easily things might have continued on their previous trajectory, with Jason's visits becoming increasingly rare, our relationship reduced to holiday phone calls and occasional flowers sent by his assistant. Sometimes love requires courage, I said softly, echoing the thought I'd had months earlier. The courage to risk rejection by setting boundaries, to create consequences that might initially cause pain but ultimately lead to healing. Jason reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I'm glad you were brave enough to take that risk, to believe I could find my way back, even when I was giving you every reason to give up on me. In that moment, surrounded by the antiseptic, scent of the hospital, and the muted sounds of medical equipment, I felt a peace that transcended the anxiety of the past few days. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and with a premature infant and a mother recovering from an emergency delivery, there would certainly be many. We would face them together, as a family reconnected through both blood and choice. The heart attack that had once seemed like a cruel twist of fate now appeared in a different light. Not just a medical crisis, but a catalyst for transformation. A moment of clarity that had set in motion a chain of events leading to this new beginning. The will change that had seemed so drastic, even manipulative in my darkest moments of self-doubt, had ultimately opened a door that might otherwise have remained forever closed. As Jason and I made our way back to Vanessa's room, where our newest family member would soon return for another brief visit from the NICU, I silently thanked my younger self for having the courage to draw a line, to insist on meaningful connection, rather than settling for the comfortable fiction of family that existed only on holidays and special occasions. Sometimes it takes almost losing something precious to truly understand its value. Sometimes it takes a heart that stops beating for a moment to remind us all how we should truly live. The journey home from the hospital 5 days later was a careful orchestration of medical precautions and family support. Vanessa, still recovering from her emergency C-section, needed assistance with almost everything, while tiny Elizabeth required constant monitoring to ensure her premature lungs continued functioning properly. Jason had transformed their living room into a temporary bedroom, so Vanessa wouldn't have to navigate stairs, and Olivia had arranged a rotation of nursing school friends to check in daily during the first crucial weeks. I found myself settling into a gentle rhythm at their house, arriving each morning to prepare meals, help with the endless laundry that even a tiny infant generates, and simply hold Elizabeth while Vanessa rested. Jason worked from home, emerging from his makeshift office every hour or so to peek at his daughter and check on his wife with a tenderness that made my heart swell. "You don't have to stay all day every day," Vanessa protested weakly one afternoon, as I folded yet another load of baby clothes. "You must have your own life to get back to." "This is my life right now," I told her simply, "being here for all of you, unless you'd rather I wasn't." "No," she said quickly, adjusting herself against the pillows of the sofa bed. "I'm not sure we'd survive without you. I just don't want you to feel obligated." I smiled, placing a tiny onesie on the growing stack. "Family isn't an obligation, Vanessa. It's a privilege." She studied me for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't understand that before. My family was always complicated. More about appearance than actual support." "I know," I said gently. After months of growing closer, Vanessa had gradually shared more about her childhood, the emotional neglect beneath the veneer of wealth, the emphasis on achievement rather than connection, the way expressions of need or vulnerability had been discouraged. I used to think Jason was just being dramatic when he talked about your Sunday dinners or summers at the cabin, she admitted. I thought he was exaggerating how close you all were, romanticizing a normal childhood into something special. And now? I prompted, curious. She glanced toward the bassinet where Elizabeth slept peacefully. Now I see he wasn't exaggerating at all. If anything, he probably didn't fully appreciate what he had until he almost lost it. She looked back at me, her eyes suddenly damp. I want her to have that. The kind of security that comes from knowing you're truly seen and valued, not for what you achieve or how you appear, but simply for existing. She will, I promised, reaching over to squeeze her hand. We'll make sure of it. Jason appeared in the doorway, his workday apparently concluded. Make sure of what? He asked, crossing the room to check on Elizabeth. That your daughter grows up surrounded by the kind of family support I wish I'd had, Vanessa explained, smiling up at him. He nodded, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Absolutely, though I think she's already got a pretty good head start in that department. The weeks that followed were a blur of pediatrician appointments, late-night feedings, and the gradual establishment of a new normal. Elizabeth thrived despite her early arrival, gaining weight steadily and developing the piercing cry that Jason jokingly referred to as her future lawyer voice. Vanessa recovered more slowly, the combination of preeclampsia and surgical delivery taking a toll on her body that required patience and continued support. By late June, however, both mother and baby were strong enough for an afternoon excursion. The destination was never in question, the family cabin, now accessible by a relatively easy drive from their Burlington home. Jason had been back once since Elizabeth's birth, checking that everything was in order for this important first visit. But Vanessa and the baby hadn't yet seen the place that had, in many ways, been the catalyst for their family's transformation. We made the journey on a perfect summer day, the car packed with far more baby paraphernalia than seemed possible for one tiny infant. Olivia and her family would join us the next day for a weekend gathering, but this first afternoon was reserved for just the 5 of us. Jason, Vanessa, Elizabeth, myself, and the memory of Edward that always seemed especially present at the cabin. As we pulled into the familiar gravel driveway, I noticed Jason watching Vanessa's reaction closely. "It's not what you're expecting, is it?" he asked, as her eyes widened at the rustic structure. "It's," she began, searching for the right words. "It's actually much more charming than I imagined. From the way you described it, I was picturing something far more primitive." Jason laughed. "Well, it doesn't have the spa bathroom or gourmet kitchen you were used to in that Aspen rental, but it's comfortable." "It's perfect," she decided, unbuckling her seatbelt. "It feels like a real home, not a vacation property." Inside, the cabin welcomed us with its familiar sense of pine and wood smoke, sunlight streaming through the windows to create pools of warmth on the worn floorboards. Jason had prepared thoughtfully, creating a cozy nook for nursing in the main living area, and setting up a portable crib in the downstairs bedroom so Vanessa wouldn't have to manage the stairs with the baby. After settling in, we gathered on the dock, Elizabeth securely cradled in her father's arms as we looked out over the sparkling water of the lake. The afternoon was warm, but not hot, a gentle breeze rustling the surrounding trees and creating tiny ripples across the water's surface. "I can see why you fought so hard to keep this place in the family," Vanessa said, her gaze sweeping across the tranquil scene. "It's not just beautiful, it has a presence, a feeling that's hard to describe." "History," Jason supplied, carefully, adjusting Elizabeth so she could take in the surroundings. "Not just family history, though there's plenty of that. But something older, something that makes our time here feel like just one chapter in a much longer story." I watched my son as he introduced his daughter to this place that had shaped so many generations of our family, his expression a mixture of pride, nostalgia, and hope for the future. The contrast with the Jason of 18 months ago, distracted, disconnected, valuing only the trappings of professional success, could not have been more profound. That evening, after Vanessa had retired early with the baby, exhausted from the excitement of the day, Jason and I sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance along the shore. "I've been wanting to show you something," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "The final paperwork for the trust modifications we discussed last year. Thomas forwarded it to me last week for review before filing." I took the envelope, curious. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. The trust had been restructured to ensure not just the preservation of the cabin itself, but the values and connections it represented. The new terms included funding for annual maintenance, clear succession planning for trustees across generations, and, most moving to me, an articulation of purpose that went beyond mere property ownership to embrace the cabin's role as a gathering place that sustained family bonds. "This is remarkable," I said, turning to the final page where there was space for signatures. "You've thought of everything." Jason shrugged, attempting to downplay the obvious care, and thought that had gone into the document. I had good legal advice, and a better example. He glanced at me sideways. "Someone who understood that sometimes you have to create structures to protect what matters most." I returned the papers to him, touched by the parallels between my original will changes and this more comprehensive evolution. "Your father would be so proud of this. Of you." "I've been thinking about him a lot lately," Jason admitted, pocketing the envelope and resuming the gentle rocking of the swing. "Wondering what kind of grandfather he would have been to Elizabeth. Wishing he could have known her." "He would have adored her," I said with absolute certainty. "And spoiled her terribly. Your father could never resist children, their curiosity, their openness to wonder." Jason smiled at that. "I have this memory of him teaching me to skip stones on the lake. I must have been about 7. I was getting frustrated because I couldn't get the angle right, and the stones kept plopping straight down instead of skipping. He spent hours with me, so patient, showing me how to hold my wrist, how to find the flattest stones. When I finally got one to skip 3 times, you'd have thought I'd won an Olympic medal from his reaction." "I remember that day," I said softly. "He came back to the cabin so proud, telling me how you'd persevered until you figured it out. He said it showed character." The conversation drifted into reminiscence, sharing memories of Edward that had been too painful to discuss in the years immediately following his death. As the night deepened around us, I realized we were doing exactly what the cabin had been preserved for: connecting across generations, maintaining the continuity of family identity through shared stories and experiences. The next morning brought Olivia and her family, the twins now old enough to be fascinated by their tiny cousin, while still young enough to require constant supervision near the water. The cabin came alive with the controlled chaos of 3 generations, enjoying each other's company, cooking meals together, swimming in the cool water of the lake, telling stories around the fire pit as evening fell. On the second night, after the children were asleep, the 4 adults gathered on the dock under a sky emblazoned with stars. Jason had opened a bottle of wine, pouring glasses for everyone except Vanessa, who was still nursing and abstaining. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his expression unusually solemn in the dim light. "To family, the one we're born into, and the one we create through choice. To second chances and new beginnings." We raised our glasses, the gentle clink echoing across the still water of the lake. "And to Mom," Jason added, turning to face me directly. "Who had the courage to draw a line when it would have been easier to accept the status quo? Who risked rejection to fight for what really matters?" "To Mom," Olivia and Vanessa echoed, raising their glasses again. Embarrassed by the attention but deeply moved, I shook my head. I just did what mothers do. We protect what's important, even when it's difficult. That's exactly the point, Jason insisted. You protected our family bonds when they were in danger of fraying beyond repair. You saw what was happening and refused to accept it as inevitable. The conversation flowed easily from there, touching on our individual journeys over the past year and a half, the heart attack that had started it all, the will change that had catalyzed Jason's return to the family, the arrival of Elizabeth who now connected us to the future. Do you ever wonder how differently things might have turned out? Vanessa asked during a lull in the conversation. If Elizabeth hadn't had her heart attack, or if she hadn't changed the will, or if Jason had simply decided to walk away from the cabin rather than meet the conditions. The question hung in the night air, inviting a contemplation of alternate paths and different choices. I think about it sometimes, Jason admitted. How close I came to losing this, all of this, without even realizing what I was giving up. He reached for Vanessa's hand, intertwining their fingers. I was so caught up in building what I thought was the right kind of life that I couldn't see how empty it was becoming. I would have kept trying to reach you, I told him quietly. Even if you had rejected the trust conditions, a mother doesn't give up, even when the path seems blocked. Olivia, who had been listening thoughtfully, added her perspective. I think the bigger question is whether any of us would have found our way to this moment without all those specific circumstances. The heart attack that forced us to confront mortality, the will change that required conscious choice rather than passive drifting, the pregnancy that connected past to future. She looked around at our little circle, illuminated only by starlight and the distant glow from the cabin windows. Maybe we needed that particular combination of crisis and opportunity to break old patterns. Her words resonated deeply, capturing something essential about the journey we had all taken. Not just a series of individual choices, but a complex interweaving of circumstance, courage, and connection that had gradually realigned our family priorities. As summer transitioned to fall, Elizabeth continued to thrive, meeting each developmental milestone with a determination that delighted her parents and amused her older cousins. Jason and Vanessa settled fully into life in Burlington, integrating themselves into the community in ways neither had anticipated. Vanessa discovered a passion for local history, joining the Historical Preservation Society, and gradually taking on increasing responsibility for their educational programs. Jason balanced his remote work for the Boston firm with occasional commuting, finding a rhythm that allowed him to remain professionally engaged while prioritizing his role as husband and father. Our Sunday family dinners, once mainly attended by Olivia's family with Jason conspicuously absent, now expanded to include both my children and their families each week. The tradition evolved organically, sometimes at my house, sometimes at Olivia's, occasionally at Jason and Vanessa's as they became more settled. The meals themselves became collaborative efforts, each family contributing dishes and helping with preparation and cleanup. One Sunday in late September, as we gathered on Jason's newly completed deck to enjoy the perfect autumn weather, I found myself watching the easy interaction between my children, the two of them clearing away lunch dishes together, laughing about some shared childhood memory while the twins played with blocks on a picnic blanket, and Vanessa gently rocked Elizabeth's carrier with her foot while joining the conversation. "Penny for your thoughts?" Mike asked, settling into the chair beside me with a cup of coffee. "Just marveling at how much can change in a relatively short time," I told him. 18 months ago, I wasn't sure Jason even remembered he had a sister, let alone enjoyed her company. Mike nodded thoughtfully. Olivia has been happier since he came back into our lives consistently. She missed him more than she let on. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the mid-afternoon sunlight dappling through the trees that surrounded Jason's property, trees that had been one of the main selling points when they'd chosen this house, reminiscent of the wooded setting of the cabin. "You know what's truly remarkable?" Mike said eventually. "The way this has all expanded beyond just healing the relationship between you and Jason. It's like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples keep spreading outward. He gestured toward Vanessa, who was now engaged in an animated conversation with Olivia about some community project they were both involved with. Vanessa has blossomed here, away from the pressures of that Boston social set. She's found meaningful work, genuine friendships. Even the twins have benefited. They adore their uncle and have so much more family stability now. I hadn't considered the full scope of the transformation, focusing primarily on the restored connection with my son. But Mike was right. The effects had rippled outward in ways I could never have anticipated when I made that desperate change to my will from a hospital bed. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I was tidying my kitchen, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Curious, I answered to find Thomas Green, my attorney, on the line. "Elizabeth?" He greeted me warmly. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," I assured him. "Is everything all right with the trust paperwork? Jason mentioned you were finalizing some details." "The trust is perfect," Thomas replied. "That's not why I'm calling. I wanted to let you know that I've recommended you to someone in a situation somewhat similar to what you faced last year. A client whose relationship with his daughter has become strained since she married and moved across the country." I was surprised by the request. I'm not sure what guidance I could offer. Every family situation is different. "Of course," Thomas agreed. "But your approach, using inheritance planning as a tool for family reconnection rather than just asset distribution, was quite innovative. Gerald is struggling with whether to use his estate plan to try to influence his daughter's choices, and I thought hearing from someone who has navigated similar waters might be helpful." The concept of my personal experience becoming a model for others had never occurred to me. "I'm not sure my approach would work for everyone," I cautioned. "It involved a lot of risk." "Meaningful change usually does," Thomas replied. "Would you be willing to speak with him? Not to prescribe a specific solution, but simply to share your journey and the principles that guided your decisions." After a moment's consideration, I agreed. "Tell him he can call me next week. I'll be happy to share what I learned, for whatever it's worth." That conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected new chapter. Over the following months, Thomas occasionally referred other clients to me. Parents estranged from adult children, siblings who had lost connection with each other, grandparents denied access to grandchildren. I never presented my experience as a universal template, but rather shared the core insights that had emerged from our family's journey. That inheritance planning could be about values as well as valuables. That sometimes love required setting boundaries rather than simply accepting whatever scraps of attention were offered. That family connections, once broken, could be mended, but required intentional effort from all parties. Word spread beyond Thomas's client base. I found myself invited to speak at estate planning seminars, then at family therapy conferences, and eventually at community centers and churches where people gathered to discuss the increasingly common problem of family estrangement in our disconnected modern world. Jason, surprisingly, became my strongest supporter in these endeavors. "You're helping people recognize problems before they reach crisis point," he told me after attending one of my talks, "making them consider what really matters while there's still time to change course." The irony wasn't lost on me, that my desperate attempt to reconnect with my own son had led to a broader mission of helping other families avoid or heal similar rifts. Life had a way of creating purpose from pain, meaning from what initially seemed like mere survival. As Elizabeth's first birthday approached in May, plans for a celebration naturally centered on the cabin. The weather cooperated beautifully, offering a warm spring day with gentle breezes and abundant sunshine. Jason and Mike spent the morning setting up tables on the large, grassy area overlooking the lake, while Olivia and Vanessa arranged flowers and decorations with the twins. Enthusiastic but not always helpful assistants. I was assigned to birthday cake duty, carefully transporting the two-tiered creation I'd spent days perfecting. A bottom layer of vanilla for the adults, topped with a smaller smash cake designed specifically for Elizabeth to destroy in the time-honored first birthday tradition. The guest list had expanded beyond our immediate family to include neighbors, colleagues, and new friends who had become part of our extended circle over the past year. Thomas came with his wife, as did several of Vanessa's co-workers from the Historical Society, and a few of Jason's colleagues who had made the trip from Boston for the occasion. As I watched Elizabeth, dressed in a pale yellow sundress with a matching ribbon in her sparse hair, being passed from guest to guest with equal enthusiasm, I couldn't help reflecting on how differently this day might have unfolded if not for the chain of events set in motion by my heart attack and subsequent will change. Would Jason and Vanessa even have had a child by now, consumed as they were, with career advancement and social positioning in Boston? Would they have felt the pull of family connection strongly enough to return to Burlington? Would Elizabeth have known the joy of cousin playmates and Sunday family dinners in this beautiful lakeside setting that had now welcomed 5 generations of our family? "She looks just like you," a voice commented beside me, interrupting my reverie. I turned to find Thomas observing the gathering with a satisfied expression. The eyes especially, that same thoughtful gaze. "She's her own little person already," I replied, watching as Jason carefully helped Elizabeth dip her toes in the lake's edge, her squeal of delight carrying across the water. "But yes, there's something of our family in her eyes." Thomas nodded, toward Jason. "He's a natural father. Hard to believe he's the same young man who was too busy for family obligations not so long ago." "People can change," I said simply, "when they reconnect with what truly matters." "Your will change was a catalyst for that reconnection," Thomas observed, "but it required his willingness to respond, to recognize what he stood to lose." "And Vanessa's insight," I added, watching as she joined her husband and daughter at the water's edge. She saw the emptiness of what they were pursuing before he did. The conversations I'd had with Vanessa over the past year had gradually revealed her role in Jason's transformation, how she had been the one to question their lifestyle after my will change arrived, challenging the assumptions that had guided their choices up to that point. Her own childhood experiences of emotional neglect had made her acutely sensitive to the patterns they were in danger of perpetuating once she allowed herself to recognize them. As the afternoon progressed to evening, guests gradually departed, until only our core family remained. We gathered on the dock as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Elizabeth drowsy in her father's arms after the excitement of the day. "I'd like to propose a toast," Olivia said, raising her glass of wine. "To Elizabeth on her first birthday. May she grow up knowing exactly how loved and wanted she is, surrounded by family who will always show up for her." "To Elizabeth." We echoed, glasses clinking in the golden light. "And to Mom," Jason added, shifting his sleeping daughter to a more comfortable position against his shoulder. "Who taught us all what it means to fight for family, not just with words, but with actions." I felt tears prick my eyes as everyone turned to me with glasses raised. The past 18 months had been a journey none of us could have anticipated. From the frightening solitude of a hospital room after a heart attack, through the painful recognition of how distanced my son had become, to the difficult decision to use my will as a tool for reconnection rather than simply a distribution of assets. The risk had been enormous. Jason might have walked away entirely, choosing his ambitious Boston life over family connection. The fragile bridge I'd tried to build through the trust conditions might have collapsed under the weight of resentment or misunderstanding. We might never have found our way back to each other. Instead, we stood together on the dock of the family cabin, 4 generations connected by choice as well as blood, celebrating not just a child's first birthday, but the renewal of bonds that had nearly been lost to negligence and distraction. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared above the lake, I watched my son gently rock his daughter, humming a lullaby that his father had once sung to him in this very spot. The circle had not been broken after all, but strengthened through conscious choice and deliberate action. Sometimes, I reflected, the most profound changes begin not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet courage to draw a line, to say this matters enough to fight for, when it would be easier to accept the slow erosion of connection. Sometimes love means risking temporary rejection for the possibility of lasting reconciliation. When Elizabeth stirred slightly in her father's arms, her tiny hand reaching up to touch his cheek in sleepy recognition, I saw the future stretching before us. Years of family gatherings at the cabin, of traditions maintained and new ones created, of bonds that might bend but would not break because we had all learned their true value. The will that I had changed in desperation from a hospital bed had accomplished far more than securing my son's presence at family gatherings. It had ultimately changed hearts. His, mine, all of ours, reminding us that inheritance is not just about property, but about values. Not just about assets, but about connection. As Jason turned to carry his sleeping daughter back to the cabin, he caught my eye and smiled. A smile of understanding, of shared purpose, of gratitude for the difficult but necessary intervention that had helped him find his way home before it was too late. In that smile, I saw everything I had hoped for when I made that painful but ultimately transformative change to my will. A son who had returned not just physically, but emotionally. A family reconnected through intentional effort, and most precious of all, the knowledge that the next generation would grow up understanding what truly matters. Sometimes, the most important inheritance we leave isn't written in legal documents at all, but in the choices we make and the examples we set when it matters most. When my son refused to visit me in the hospital after my heart attack, the change I made to my will altered not just the distribution of property, but the course of all our lives, turning what might have been a story of gradual estrangement into one of renewal, reconnection, and redemption. 2 years passed in a rhythm of seasons at the cabin, birthdays celebrated, holidays shared, and countless ordinary moments that formed the tapestry of our reconnected family life. Elizabeth grew from a toddling 1-year-old into a spirited 3-year-old, with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's determined chin. The cabin had become her second home, a place she asked for by name even before she could properly pronounce it. Ka-in, go ka-in, became a regular request, especially during the long Vermont winters when the frozen lake offered new adventures. On a crisp October morning in my 66th year, I sat on the cabin porch wrapped in one of Edward's old sweaters, watching Jason teach Elizabeth how to identify different birds at the feeder he'd installed the previous summer. His patience, with her endless questions and wandering attention span, showed how completely he had embraced fatherhood, finding joy in the small moments that his former self would have considered mundane or even tedious. "Chickadee," Elizabeth announced triumphantly as a small black-capped bird alighted briefly before darting away. "That's right, sweet pea," Jason confirmed, his pride evident. "And look, what's that bigger one with the blue feathers?" Elizabeth consulted. The picture book spread across their laps. "Blue." "Jay," she sounded out carefully. "Blue jays are noisy." "Just like certain little girls I know," Jason teased, tickling her until she dissolved into giggles. Vanessa emerged from the cabin, carrying a tray with mugs of hot cider, her pregnancy now visible beneath her oversized sweater. The news of a second child had been joyfully received by the entire family 3 months earlier, with the twins particularly excited about another cousin joining their expanding circle. "Any cardinals today?" she asked, setting the tray on the small table and easing herself into a chair. "Not yet," Jason replied, accepting a mug with thanks. "But we saw a woodpecker earlier." Elizabeth did a pretty impressive imitation of its pecking. "I'm sure she did," Vanessa said with an indulgent smile. She's been practicing on the kitchen cabinets all week. Our peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Moments later, Olivia's minivan came into view, followed by a car I didn't recognize. As Olivia parked and emerged with Mike and the twins, the second vehicle revealed Thomas Green, my attorney, and an older couple who remained by their car, looking uncertain. "I hope we're not intruding," Olivia called as they approached the porch. "Thomas called yesterday about the Harringtons," she gestured to the couple, "and I suggested we might all meet here rather than in his office. I should have checked with you first." "Not at all," I assured her, rising to greet our unexpected visitors. "Any friends of Thomas are welcome here." Thomas made the introductions as we all gathered on the porch, expanded last year to accommodate our growing family gatherings. Harold and Margaret Harrington were in their 70s, their weathered faces bearing the unmistakable strain of long-term worry. "Elizabeth has been kind enough to speak with several families in situations similar to yours," Thomas explained to the Harringtons. "When you mentioned wanting to see a concrete example of how a family trust centered around a property might work to rebuild connections, I thought of the Wilsons immediately." Understanding dawned as I connected this visit to a brief conversation with Thomas the previous week. The Harringtons were estranged from their only son, who had moved across the country with his family following a business disagreement with his father. Now, in their advancing years, they were desperate to reconnect before it was too late, especially to know their grandchildren who had been born during the years of silence. "We've tried everything," Margaret explained, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "Letters, phone calls, even flying out to California unannounced. David simply refuses to engage." "The business conflict happened almost 7 years ago," Harold added, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. "I made mistakes, said things in anger that I regret. But surely at some point, families should transcend business disagreements." Jason, who had been quietly listening while helping Elizabeth with her cider, spoke up unexpectedly. "Sometimes the original conflict isn't really the issue anymore," he said gently. "It becomes a symbol of deeper hurts, unmet expectations on both sides." Harold turned to him, clearly surprised by this insight from a younger man. "Did you and your mother have a similar falling out?" "Not a dramatic conflict," Jason admitted. "More a gradual drifting apart that I allowed to happen, focused as I was on my career and status. I convinced myself I was too busy for family, obligations, that sending gifts or making occasional calls was sufficient." "What changed?" Margaret asked, hope flickering in her tired eyes. Jason glanced at me, then at his daughter, now exploring the porch steps under Vanessa's watchful eye. "My mother had the courage to draw a line, to show me what I stood to lose if I continued on that path. And I was fortunate enough to recognize the wake-up call before it was too late." For the next hour, our family shared the story of our journey, not as a prescription for the Harringtons, but as an example of how intentional structures could sometimes create space for reconnection when direct appeals had failed. Jason spoke with remarkable candor about his former priorities and the emptiness he had only recognized in retrospect. The twins, now old enough to understand parts of the conversation, contributed their perspective on having their uncle return to their lives. "The cabin trust was just a tool," I explained as the conversation wound down. "The essential element was the choice it presented, a choice that required conscious reflection rather than passive continuation of existing patterns." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "We have a summer home in the Adirondacks that's been in my family for generations. David loved it as a child, though he hasn't been back since the estrangement. Perhaps. Every family is different," Jason cautioned. "What worked for us might not be the right approach for your situation." "But the principle is the same," Margaret said, new determination in her voice. "Creating a reason to engage that goes beyond just our desire for reconciliation. Something that connects to values David still holds, even if he's shut us out personally." As the Harringtons prepared to leave after sharing lunch on the expanded porch, Margaret embraced me impulsively. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the first time in years, I feel like there might be a path forward." "Courage," I told her softly. "It takes courage on both sides." The visit left me reflective as the day continued, watching Elizabeth chase falling leaves with her cousins while the adults prepared dinner in the cabin's recently renovated kitchen. The renovation had been Jason's project the previous summer, an updated space that preserved the cabin's rustic charm while making it more functional for our growing family gatherings. "The Harringtons reminded me of something," Jason said as he chopped vegetables beside me at the counter. "Do you remember what you told me in the hospital after your heart attack? When I finally showed up after you'd been there nearly 2 weeks?" I tried to recall the conversation, but the details were hazy, obscured by the medication and physical weakness of that time. "Not specifically. I remember being both relieved and angry to see you. You said, sometimes people need to be reminded of what matters before it's too late." It seemed like such a simple statement at the time, almost a platitude. He scraped the vegetables into a waiting pot. I had no idea how profoundly it would change the course of all our lives. Later that evening, with Olivia's family departed and Elizabeth finally asleep after multiple bedtime stories, the four of us, Jason, Vanessa, myself, and Thomas, who had stayed to discuss some minor trust updates, sat around the fireplace enjoying a last cup of tea before turning in. "The cabin has become exactly what you hoped," Thomas observed, looking around the space now filled with photographs documenting our reconnected family life. "A genuine center for multiple generations." "More than I hoped," I admitted. "When I made those changes to my will from the hospital bed, I was operating from desperation as much as insight. I couldn't have predicted how completely it would transform our relationships. Or how many other families it would ultimately help," Thomas added. "Your story has resonated with so many of my clients facing similar estrangements." Jason leaned forward, firelight playing across his features that increasingly resembled his father's as he entered his 40s. "I've been thinking about that aspect, how Mom's decision has created ripples beyond our family. The talks she gives now at community centers and churches, the families like the Harringtons who find hope in our experience." "What about them?" Vanessa prompted when he paused. "I think we should formalize it somehow," Jason continued. "Create a foundation or organization focused on helping families heal estrangement before it's too late. Something that offers resources, guidance, perhaps even mediation services." The suggestion caught me by surprise. "That seems like a significant undertaking." "It is," Jason acknowledged. "But think about how many families are suffering as we were, parents and children disconnected by misunderstanding, siblings estranged over old hurts, grandparents denied relationships with grandchildren. What if the insights we've gained could help others find their way back to each other?" Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "There's certainly a need. I see it regularly in my practice. The deep pain of family estrangement underlying so many estate planning discussions. People using inheritance as their final attempt to either punish or reconcile, often without the kind of thoughtful structure Elizabeth created." "What would this organization actually do?" Vanessa asked, always practical. Jason's eyes lit with the same intensity he once reserved exclusively for his corporate ambitions. "Education, for one thing. Helping people understand the patterns that lead to estrangement and strategies for addressing them before relationships fracture completely. Resources for those already estranged who want to rebuild connections. Training for mediators specializing in family reconciliation." As he outlined his vision, I marveled at the transformation in my son. The man who had once been too busy advancing his career to visit his hospitalized mother was now proposing to dedicate significant time and resources to helping other families avoid similar pain. "The Family Reconnection Project," Vanessa suggested, placing a hand on her growing belly. "A legacy for our children, teaching them that family bonds require intentional maintenance, not just biological connection. "I think it's a wonderful idea," I said finally. "Though I'm not sure what role I could play. I'm hardly an expert in family dynamics, just someone who made a desperate decision that happened to work out." "You're the heart of it," Jason insisted. "The person who had the courage to intervene when it would have been easier to simply accept the status quo. That's the message other families need to hear, that sometimes love means setting boundaries, creating consequences, demanding engagement, rather than settling for the illusion of connection." In the months that followed, Jason's vision took shape with characteristic thoroughness. Working with Thomas, he established a nonprofit foundation with an initial focus on educational resources and family mediation services. Olivia contributed her insights as a nurse who had witnessed countless family dynamics in crisis situations, while Vanessa applied her organizational skills to creating a practical framework for the foundation's activities. My role evolved naturally into that of storyteller, sharing our family's journey not as a universal template, but as an example of how intentional intervention could sometimes bridge seemingly unbridgeable gaps. The talks I had already been giving expanded into workshops, then a small book that Thomas helped me publish through a local press. By the time Jason and Vanessa's second child, a boy they named Thomas Edward, arrived in early spring, the Family Reconnection Project had already assisted dozens of estranged families in beginning difficult but necessary conversations. Some found their way back to each other as we had. Others reached new understandings that acknowledged past hurts while creating space for limited but meaningful connection. Throughout it all, the cabin remained our family's anchor, the physical manifestation of the values we had fought to preserve and strengthen. On summer evenings, watching Elizabeth teach her baby brother to feel the pine needles beneath their bare feet, or seeing the twins now tall enough to take the rowboat out on their own, I often thought about the profound wisdom in Edward's original insistence that the property remain in the family. He had understood something essential that I had only fully grasped after my heart attack, that in an increasingly fragmented world, places of connection and continuity become not just pleasant luxuries but vital necessities. The cabin wasn't merely a vacation home, but a tangible reminder of who we were to each other, a physical space that invited us to slow down and remember what truly mattered. On my 70th birthday, celebrated at the cabin with a family that now included 4 grandchildren and an expanding circle of friends who had become almost family themselves, Jason surprised me with a leather-bound album. Inside were photographs documenting our journey of reconnection, beginning with tentative images from that first Memorial Day weekend after the will change, progressing through Elizabeth's birth and early years, Thomas Edward's arrival, and countless family gatherings at the cabin. The final pages contained something unexpected: letters from families who had found their way back to each other through the Family Reconnection Project, many specifically mentioning how our story had given them hope during their darkest moments of estrangement. "Your courage created all of this," Jason wrote in his inscription. "One decision, made from a hospital bed, changed not just our family but countless others. Thank you for fighting for us when it would have been easier to give up." As I closed the album, surrounded by the family that had nearly slipped away, and the new generations that might never have known true connection without that pivotal intervention, I felt a sense of completion that transcended any material legacy I might leave behind. The will change that had once seemed so drastic, even manipulative in my moments of doubt, had ultimately served its highest purpose, not just preserving a piece of property, but preserving the heart of our family itself. The trust conditions had been merely the vehicle. The real inheritance had been the recognition that family bonds, once taken for granted, required intentional care and cultivation to thrive. Looking around at the gathered faces, Jason now fully embracing his roles as father, brother, son, and advocate for family reconnection. Vanessa finding fulfillment in community engagement and motherhood. Olivia and her family so seamlessly integrated with her brothers that the children moved between households with the easy confidence of belonging everywhere, and the newest grandchildren who would never know a time when family gathering was anything but natural and expected. I felt a profound gratitude for that moment of clarity in a hospital room years earlier. Sometimes the most important changes we make aren't carefully planned or strategically executed, but born of desperate hope in moments of crisis. When my son refused to visit me in the hospital, the single change I made to my will ultimately changed everything. Not just for us, but for a widening circle of families who found in our story the courage to write new chapters in their own. As evening fell and stars appeared above the cabin that had witnessed 5 generations of our family's journey, I silently thanked Edward for his foresight in preserving this place that had ultimately preserved us. In the laughter of grandchildren and the quiet conversations of adult children who had found their way back to genuine connection, I heard the echo of his favorite saying, "What matters most is rarely what shines brightest at first glance." The heart attack that had seemed like an ending had become instead a beginning. The will change that had appeared desperate had been revealed as transformative. And the son who had once been too busy to visit his hospitalized mother now dedicated himself to ensuring other families wouldn't lose years to estrangement as we nearly had. Sometimes, it takes almost losing everything to recognize what truly matters. And sometimes, the most important inheritance we leave isn't what's written in legal documents, but the courage to fight for connection when it would be easier to drift apart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.